this is where we're going to be. This is where we're going to do our davening. And the question is, where should we sit? Because the rabbis will not be up here. They're going to be down there. So should we spread out?
Now, are they using a handheld?
They're coming up here.
Oh, so they're coming up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
maybe we should just be along the side here.
Yeah, we can do that. Or somebody can be over here, and somebody can be over there, and somebody can be over there. And we come up in different places. What do you think about that? Why don't you plan to sit over there, right here, and I'm going to sit here, and we'll see where Kim wants to sit.
Okay. Sure.
All right, and I'm going to...
And how fussy is this microphone?
Do you want to try it out?
Because my mouth and it are not...
Yeah, there you can.
Okay, so it's not bad if I move it
Right.
for where I need it.
Right, exactly.
And it goes back there as if by instinct. Okay. So the two of you won't be bothered.
No.
At 5'2" of me soaking wet, we'll still be able to survive. And very good. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing too much.
Okay, I'm going to lock this for right now. Okay?
I think that's fine.
And I'm going to do Havdalah now.
Shavua Tov. Wonderful to be with all of you who are here at Tikvat Israel in our sanctuary and those who are joining us via the live stream. It has been a long time since we've been able to bring our four congregations together in person. We continue doing the Selichot each year online, but it's not quite the same thing, as we all know. And so it's really wonderful to be able to be here, to join together, and also to make sure that those who aren't yet comfortable being in a room like this are able to join us as well. Tonight, to help get us in the right frame of mind in certain ways and to help us do a little bit of learning as well, we are very pleased to have Wayne Hoffman with us as our speaker. Wayne is a native of Silver Spring who grew up attending Shari Tefillah. He and his husband Mark currently live in New York City and the Catskills. Wayne has been a journalist for over 30 years. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Forward, the Washington Blade, and many other publications. He's currently the executive editor of Tablet magazine, which is an online Jewish magazine. And if you haven't read it, I highly commend it to you. There's a lot of very thoughtful pieces. Some you'll agree, some you won't. But it's one of the more thoughtful places, I think, on the internet. He's also the author of 3 novels, including Sweet Like Sugar, a story about an unlikely friendship between an elderly Orthodox rabbi and a young gay man, which is set here in Montgomery County and which won the American Library Association's Stonewall Book Award. His latest book, from which he'll be reading this evening, is a true crime family memoir called The End of Her, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder. We're really pleased that Wayne is able to join with us this evening, and I want to invite him up here to come do some reading, and then we'll have an opportunity afterwards for some Q&A.
Shavua Tov, good evening. my brother's used to standing up here. I'm not used to standing up here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Rabbi, well, there's a lot of rabbis to thank. Thank you, Rabbi Arian, Rabbi Nagelberg, Rabbi Silver, and of course, Rabbi Lehman for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight to hear me talk about murder for a bit. Murder and Alzheimer's. I promise it'll be fun. As Rabbi Israel mentioned, my latest book is called The End of Her, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder. And I'm going to read tonight for about 20 minutes from the book and then open it up for questions. Rabbi Israel is going to start some questions, and then anyone else has a question, just, shout it out, and I'll do my best to answer it. Can everyone hear me? It's not usually a problem for me.
Can you speak a little slower?
That I can work on. Throughout my childhood in Silver Spring, my mother's memories tended to be keen and detailed, particularly memories from her youth. Every detail came with a story, usually a funny one, because if there's one thing everyone who ever met my mother could agree on, it was this: Susan Hoffman knew how to tell a story. Her stories were told with great skill and a knack for getting right to the funny part, but one of her tales was not so funny. It was the strangest set piece in her repertoire. When I was growing up in Jersey City, she'd begin, I found a photograph in my parents' drawer. At just 7 or 8 years old, she recognized the man in the black and white picture, unsmiling, seated in a chair with a trim mustache and neatly parted hair, as her maternal grandfather, whom she called Zeta David. She'd met him once on a family trip to Winnipeg, where her mother Ethel had grown up. But the woman next to David in the picture, also stern-faced, but tall and narrow-waisted with her hair swept upward, didn't look familiar. "Who's this woman with Zeta David?" my mother asked. "That's my mother," came Ethel's reply. "No, it's not," said my mother, who had met her grandmother, Baba Bela, Yiddish for Grandma Bela, on that same trip to Winnipeg. "Baba Bela," she said, "is short and fat." "Well, Baba Bela isn't really my mother. She's my stepmother," Ethel replied. "This was my mother." She turned the photo over, and on the back, in pencil, was written a name my mother had never heard before: Sarah Brooks. My mother, surprised to learn her grandmother wasn't her grandmother after all, asked, well, what happened to Sarah Brooks? And this is what her mother told her. One winter morning when I was very, very young, my mother was nursing her new baby, your Aunt Anne, outside on our front porch in Winnipeg when a sniper drove by and shot her dead. Ethel continued to explain the rest of her family history briefly. David, her father, now a widower with 4 children, went on to marry Bella, herself a widow with 1 child, and together they had 3 more children. While Sarah had been Ethel's biological mother, Bella had been the only mother she had known most of her life. It had long irked my mother that she'd been given the Hebrew name Shifra, a lowly handmaiden from the Torah, especially when her little sister Marilyn got the Hebrew name Malka, meaning queen. But now she learned the reason. Shifra had been Sarah's Hebrew name. And in keeping with Ashkenazi tradition, my mother, Susan, had been named in memory of Sarah. My grandmother Ethel was not the kind of person who took kindly to being interrogated, so my mother, who was never one to talk back to authority figures anyway, simply accepted this story of the drive-by sniper as fact. It became one of her favorite stories. She told it to my brother, my sister, and me many, many times while we were growing up. Given my mother's skills as a storyteller, it's no surprise that we first saw signs of her mental decline when she was telling stories at my house in the Catskills over the 4th of July weekend back in 2009. She told a funny story about her sister, my Aunt Marilyn, and everyone at the table laughed. Then, seconds after landing the punchline, she began the same story again, verbatim. One of my nephews, her oldest grandson, pointed out that she just told this story. "I did? When?" she asked. "About 30 seconds ago," came his reply. The next week, back home in Silver Spring, my mother saw a neurologist who diagnosed her with mild cognitive impairment. Not Alzheimer's, or not yet. Mom was 69. During Passover in 2010, the first family gathering after that fateful 4th of July in the Catskills, I drove from New York City back to Maryland a day before the rest of the family arrived, armed with a miniature video camera, so I could record my mother telling family stories before her memory deteriorated further. The camera captured not only her memories, but also her emergent mental struggles, gaps in her narratives, key details, punchlines missing from familiar tales, and a few moments of true forgetfulness when she'd stare into the camera with total blankness. I asked what she was told about her mother's mother, Sarah. My mother's parents are Sarah Brooks and David Feinstein, she began, one Shifra talking about another. As we started going through the maternal side of her family tree, she remembered the drive-by shooting when a truck went whizzing by and shot Sarah, even if she wasn't sure anymore whether it was her father or her mother who actually told her about the story. But the basic plot was always the same. Sarah Brooks, baby at her breast, shot by a drive-by sniper. I never believed this story when I was growing up, but I had never openly confronted my mother with my doubts. My goal in making the video in 2010 wasn't to question her, it was to listen to her. Well, I still could, but still I could barely contain my good-humored skepticism as I prodded her to tell this story of this drive-by shooting in Winnipeg that the family somehow believes happened. My giddiness rubbed off on her. She smirked as she told the story on camera, but neither of us said flat out that this story was a lie. This was the story my mother grew up with, and she was sticking with it, no matter how unlikely it sounded. Why would someone make up such an awful story, she asked. My mother didn't have a lot of time to sit and reminisce after I made the video. She still had to prepare for the Passover Seder. I ran the service around the table, but she had to make dinner for more than 20 people. Matzo ball soup, brisket, a turkey, and a spare turkey because she was always needlessly worried there wouldn't be enough food, stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes. The Seder went off without a hitch. It always did. The next night, Susan and Marilyn, my mother and my aunt, were sitting on the living room couch going through a plastic shopping bag filled with old photos. These had been their mother's photos, which she'd never properly labeled or put in an album. After my grandmother Ethel died in 1983, they ended up in the back of my parents' linen closet, largely unexamined and in no particular order. Eventually, my mother and my aunt came across the photo of Zeta David and Sarah Brooks, a sepia-toned 4x6-inch print in a cardboard frame. As they looked at the photograph, the same one my mother had found in a drawer 60 years earlier, the only photo of the two of them in existence, they started to tell the story again. Passover is a holiday that specifically instructs us to tell stories about the ancient Israelites' exodus from Egypt again and again, so that future generations of listeners will make them part of their own histories. At our family Seders, we also shared stories about our childhoods, our families, Passovers past, so that these, too, would become part of a history shared by everyone around the Seder table. I'd held my tongue, more or less, when I'd made the video a couple days earlier, but now I stopped my mother and my Aunt Marilyn in the middle of their story. I call BS, I said. You know the story's not true, right? Their eyes opened wide. Not, I think, because they really believed the story, but because no one had ever dared to question it. It doesn't make any sense, I said. First of all, who breastfeeds outside in the middle of winter in Winnipeg? Second of all, what was this? It's the 19-teens. How many cars were there in Winnipeg? A dozen? And why on earth would a drive-by sniper, assuming there was such a thing back then, why would he be shooting nursing mothers in broad daylight? And then how could he have good enough aim with an old shotgun to kill her, but leave the baby at her breast unharmed while he made a getaway in a Model T? But that's the story we were told, my mother said. Why would we question it? Because, I said, it's so obviously not true. She let this sink in. I wasn't teasing anymore. I was calling her bluff. But if it isn't true, she said, then what really happened? Now she was calling my bluff. Okay, smarty pants, you tell the story. I was silent for a moment. Even though I'd suspected since I was a child that this story was a fabrication, I'd never taken time to think what the real story might be. But I also had a measure of confidence that after 20 years at that point as a journalist, I could find out the truth about Sarah Brooks and solve this mystery that had hung over the family for nearly a century. I thought it would take weeks. It took a decade. But in the end, I did find some answers. Most of the story my mother told me was, in fact, BS. There was no breastfeeding outside in winter. There was no drive-by sniper. But one key element was true. Sarah had been murdered in the Jewish immigrant-heavy north end of Winnipeg, just 7 years after she'd immigrated from Russia and married my great-grandfather, a cattle dealer named David Feinstein. The crime, her murder, made headlines across Canada in English and Yiddish newspapers, and it was never solved. Here's what really happened. No one in the house heard the intruder fire a gun at Sarah Feinstein's right temple as she slept in the early hours of Friday, August 1st, 1913. Even 2-year-old Fanny, curled up at her mother's breast, continued to sleep as the blood seeped into the sheets and dampened her nightgown. It was Anne, the infant in the crib next to Sarah's bed, who made the first noise shortly after 2:45 in the morning. She started crying, perhaps because she'd seen a stranger in the house or sensed that someone had hurt her mother, although there was no confrontation or struggle. Or maybe she was just hungry and wanted to be fed. It wasn't unusual for Anne, who was a baby, to wake up crying in the middle of the night, but it was unusual for the crying to continue without Sarah tending to the baby's needs. Harry, the oldest child, 2 weeks shy of his 6th birthday, sensed that Anne's crying was an indication something was wrong. He got up from the room where he was sleeping alongside his little sister Ethel, my grandmother, and the family's current hired girl, a Ukrainian immigrant named Victoria Komanowska, and he walked into his mother's bedroom in the rear of the house to wake her up. When he couldn't wake her, he told Victoria, who also tried to rouse Sarah without success. The small red light Sarah typically left on during the night had been extinguished, so she turned it on, and that's when she saw the blood. Frightened and unsure what to do, without Sarah's husband David at home, Victoria shouted to the neighbors, Lucy Kessler, through the window, "I've been calling my mistress and she won't wake up." Then Victoria ran out the front door, which was closed but unlocked, something she noticed because she had locked the doors before going to bed. Victoria woke the Kasners next door at 516 Magnus Avenue. "I can't wake the missus," she told them through her tears. Lucy Kessler arrived first and accompanied Victoria to the back bedroom. While Sarah lay motionless with Fanny still asleep at her side, baby Anne was crying in the crib. Lucy picked her up to comfort her. Robert Kastner from next door came in next with a young man named Abram Shurman. Robert saw the bullet hole in Sarah's right temple, and Abram shouted at Victoria, "You are crazy, this woman's been shot." Abram ran back next door to call the police. The Feinstein house, like most in the North End, but at that point didn't have a telephone. He called 2 local doctors, Dr. George Hirsch Kolichman and Dr. Abram Berkovich, who had delivered Ethel, my grandmother, when she was born in 1909. Kolichman arrived first, just after 3 o'clock in the morning, and found Sarah in bed, facing the wall. He pronounced her dead. Her body was still warm, indicating to him she'd been shot within the previous half hour. Eventually, 2 police officers did show up from North Winnipeg Station to find Sarah in a peaceful pose, her cheek resting against her hands on the blood-soaked pillow, while her children lay on a cot at the foot of her bed crying. The house was cordoned off, pending a full coroner's jury that was called for 5 o'clock that afternoon. Other than police, there were now more than 20 police officers on the scene. The only person allowed inside the Feinstein's front gate was a representative of the local Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, which would ensure that someone would sit with Sarah's body until burial in accordance with Jewish law. After several unsuccessful efforts to reach David, her husband, by telephone, he was away on business in Kenora, Saskatchewan, where he was buying cattle. Abram ultimately contacted him by telegraph shortly after noon. Informed of his wife's death, David set out for Winnipeg by train as quickly as he could, but there was only one direct train on that route each day, leaving at 4:55 in the afternoon. Kenora was 300 miles northwest of Winnipeg on the Canadian Northern Railway. He wouldn't make it back until the following morning. So his brother Harry's wife, Pauline, took in David and Sarah's children at her house down the block on Magnus Avenue in the North End. As temperatures climbed into the 80s that afternoon, people gathered in the heat outside 520 Magnus Avenue, talking in Yiddish about what had happened and who might be responsible. Most fingers pointed at a woman named Mary Monastaka and her boyfriend Stefan Kashowski. The previous Friday, neighbors said, Sarah had dismissed Mary, a Galician girl she'd recently hired. Sarah reportedly didn't approve of Mary's relationship with Stefan, a 24-year-old brakeman for the railroad who lived in a boarding house a block away on Selkirk Avenue. After Mary was fired, the story went, she tried to convince 17-year-old Victoria, who had started working for Sarah 4 months earlier when she arrived in Canada, to follow her out the door. When Victoria was scrubbing the veranda, Mary stopped on the sidewalk to admonish her. "Why do you work for Jews?" she asked. When she couldn't goad Victoria into responding, she stepped up onto the veranda to continue her tirade. The Jews were cast out of Russia, Mary told her using expletives, and so they should be in Canada too. Sarah came out of the house at this point and shoved Mary off the veranda. According to neighbors who claimed to have witnessed the exchange, Mary left vowing revenge. As the news of the murder spread through the North End, a crowd gathered outside the Feinsteins' home. There were never fewer than 300 people on the street that day, barred from entering by a local constable who blocked the doorway. Journalists from Winnipeg's rival daily newspapers, the Manitoba Free Press and Winnipeg Telegram, which came out in the mornings, and the afternoon Winnipeg Tribune, spoke with the onlookers digging for information, but like the police, who were talking to neighborhood residents in hopes of finding clues, they were faced with a language barrier, since locals tended to speak Yiddish, or Polish, or Ukrainian. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Tribune splashed news of the murder across the top of its front page. "Prominent member of Hebrew colony shot to death while she slept," read the headline, 4 columns wide, above a large photograph identified as their wedding portrait. The same photograph my mother would find decades later. Anti-Semitism was cited as the possible motive. Both hired girls, Victoria and Mary, were taken to the Central Police Station and held as material witnesses. Stefan had not been arrested, but he had been spotted. After allegedly skipping work that day at the rail yards, he appeared just before 9 o'clock at Feynman's Confectionery Store at 192 Andrew Street, around the block from the Feinsteins' house. He bought a bottle of aerated water and sat in a box to drink it. He casually asked the proprietress what had happened on Magnus Avenue to attract such a crowd. "Don't you read the papers?" she replied. "Mrs. Feinstein was shot at 3 o'clock this morning." Stefan told her he hadn't read about the crime because he couldn't read English. Then he asked if anyone had been arrested. "Oh, yes," said the shopkeeper, who recognized him as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Feinstein's girl, and the one who used to come here with you." Stefan knew she meant Mary, whom he'd brought in more than once to buy a pop. His lips started to quiver. He dropped the bottle on the floor where it smashed into shards, and he fled out the door. As the sun set around 8:10 on Friday night, the Jewish Sabbath began. In synagogues across the North End, by now there were a dozen of them. All the talk was of the young mother who'd been murdered early that morning. The next day, Saturday, August 2nd, David's train arrived in Winnipeg at 7:20 in the morning. The story of his wife's murder appeared in all 3 daily newspaper Saturday editions. Journalists tried to interview David, but as the Tribune explained, he appears to have suffered terribly since the news was broken to him and was altogether too much under stress of grief to speak to reporters. On the same day, synagogues across Winnipeg were reading that week's Torah portion, Maseh, the final section from the Book of Numbers. Preparing the children of Israel to enter the Promised Land, God tells Moses in Maseh to instruct people to set up cities of refuge when they enter Canaan. But anyone who intentionally kills another person with a stone or a wooden tool or an iron object will not be allowed sanctuary there. That person is a murderer, the Torah makes plain. That person must be put to death. My research into Sarah's murder lasted years. At first, I would tell my mother what I'd discovered, and she'd remember it. Then I would tell her what I'd discover, and she'd soon forget it. New memories were wiped away like chalk on a blackboard. Eventually, as I continued my investigation, her memory lapses got worse and worse until she forgot much more than the story of a murder from a century ago. She forgot her own life story. Cars lined both sides of our tiny street in the Catskills on a Saturday morning in September 2013. It was Yom Kippur, the one day of the year when the small Reform synagogue across from our house draws a large crowd and its tiny parking lot overflows in every direction. I was home with my husband Mark on the couch, but back in Maryland, I knew my parents would be spending endless hours at services that day. So I was surprised when my cell phone rang early that afternoon. I assumed it was my father, since my mother had never called my cell phone before. But this time, for the first time, it was my mother, with a seemingly simple but devastating question. "Where's Mom?" she asked, without saying hello. I paused, trying to figure out what she meant. "Whose mom?" I replied. "You're my mom." "No, my mom," she said. "Your mother died in 1983, I told her, as calmly as clearly as I could manage. "What about my dad?" 1977, I said. "Aha," she said. No discernible emotion, just registering what I told her. She was confused, but she wasn't panicked. "Why are you asking me?" I asked her. "Because," she said, "we're at their house, and your father's taking a nap, and I want to make sure he's up before they get back." Now, my father probably was taking a nap between services. This was common enough for a Yom Kippur afternoon when he'd gone all day without food and, more importantly, coffee. But the rest of what my mother said didn't compute. I didn't want to rattle her, so I tried being logical and concise. "Are you in a house right now?" I asked. She was. "Your parents never had a house," I said. "They always lived in apartments, remember?" "Right," she said. Then she was quiet for a few seconds. "Then whose house is this?" "It's your house," I said. "Since when?" she asked. "For the past 42 years, I said, since I was a baby." She asked where she lived before that house, and I told her. She asked about the place before that and the one before that, until we finally got to Chicago. My parents lived there for a year when my older brother was a baby, and it was a painful time. Between the social isolation, the frigid weather, and my father's job, they were miserable. "I've only ever seen your father cry 2 times," my mother would later tell me, "when Kennedy was shot and when we lived in Chicago." "I remember Chicago," my mother replied, in a tone that made it clear she had no nostalgia for the city. "That was 1964, I told her, 6 years before I was born." Whether she fully grasped what I told her or not, about the house and about her parents, she sounded relieved. "I knew you'd have the answers," she said. "That's why I called you." After she hung up, I could drop the pretense of taking this surreal phone call in stride. I stood in the doorway of our living room, and for the first time since she was diagnosed, I cried for my mother. Up to this point, my mother's memory loss had been many things to me. Most often it was simply tedious, as I'd have to repeat things over and over. Sometimes it was frustrating. If there was something I wanted her to understand and there was no way to penetrate the fog. Occasionally it was amusing for both of us when she forgot something. She could still laugh about her lapses when she knew that they were happening. But now with this phone call, things had reached a new level. This wasn't something trivial, someone's name, what day it was, an article in the newspaper. It wasn't even like her grandmother Sarah's murder 100 years ago. This was an important part of her own personal history that she was losing. How could someone forget their own mother was dead? But I was also shaken for a more personal reason. If she was losing her memory of everything that had happened in the last 50 years, I worried, as a 42-year-old, that meant she might soon forget about me entirely. Would my entire life vanish from her mind? If she could forget that her mother died, couldn't she just as easily forget that her son had been born? Ever since she'd been diagnosed, I dreaded the day I would lose my mother. But on that Yom Kippur, I started to worry about a much more awful possibility, that my mother might lose me first.
Wow. That is an incredible story.
Thank you.
Can I ask about is your mom still with us?
She is. She is very technically still with us. About 6 years ago, she moved out of the house, right? 6 years ago, I think. Moved out of the house into a memory care facility where she lived for about a year. And then after that, when it became clear that even that was not a safe enough place for her to live without hurting herself, she moved into a much smaller residential facility in Potomac, where she still is today. We just saw her this morning. The good news is that she is safe and that she is not in distress. The bad news is that's all the good news there is. There is really nothing more positive to say, but the journey to get here did involve a period of a few years, actually, where there was horrible distress for her and for my father and for me and our whole family and everyone who knew her. She's now so far gone that she's not filled with anxiety, but the period in the middle when she was still living at home was truly, truly horrible for a couple of years.
Wow. Thinking back, is there anything that you would think about in terms of how you related to her during that time period, things that you advise to people who are dealing?
Yeah, definitely. I wrote a piece for Newsweek last month, and there's a story that it's not in the book, but it's a story that sometimes something happens and you don't realize until years later just how much that tiny incident had an impact. So when my mother was still living at home, so this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, things were bad. They were clearly bad, and it was taking a toll on everyone, but particularly my father. They were living in Silver Spring, in the house where I grew up. And my mother was going to a day group for people with Alzheimer's. It was somewhat social. It was also just custodial so that she would be out of the house and my father could have time to work and also, breathe for a minute. She was going to this day group during the day, and the same man who ran that day group for my mother ran an evening group, a support group for my father, for caregivers. So he knew both my parents. And I'd come home to Maryland, and this man, Jim, was at my parents' house visiting. And he took me aside and he said, "How's your father doing?" I'm telling tales in front of my father who's sitting here. It's nothing he doesn't know. And I said, he's, it's difficult, but he's hanging in there. But he's determined to take care of my mother as long as he can. And Jim, this man who ran the support group for my mother and my father, this is what he does for a living. He looked at me and he said, "Right, why?" I said, "What do you mean, why? Why is my father going to take care of my mother as long as he can? Because that's what a decent person does. That's what a decent husband does. That's what a decent caregiver does." "I don't understand. What do you mean, why?" He said, "Look, Alzheimer's is not like a broken arm. It doesn't heal in 6 weeks and then you're back to normal. It only gets worse. And the toll it takes only gets worse. And what you're saying when you say you're going to take care of her as long as you possibly can, until you can't do it anymore, means one of two things. You're either going to do it until you are completely exhausted and wrung out and you're of no use as a caregiver, or you're going to do it until there's an emergency and something goes terribly, terribly wrong and you have no choice and you're forced to get help and move her into a facility." He said, if we know one or both of those things is going to happen, and one or both of those things is going to happen, we all know it, why wait until it happens and there's a crisis? Why not move sooner? We know what the next step is. And I heard him intellectually, and I told my father, and we talked about it intellectually, and then, of course, did not follow that advice. And there came a Passover in, I think it was 2016, when I had talked to my father, and when I said things are getting even worse somehow. How will we know when it's time to move her? And he laid out a couple of red lines. He said, if this happens or this happens or this happens, I'll know that's a sign. And by the 8th day of Passover, all of those things had happened in the span of 1 week, a series of crises. And it was no longer safe for her to stay at home. It was no longer safe for my father to be in the house with her because she almost burned the house down with him asleep upstairs. So the advice I would give people is take the advice that we should have taken that now in retrospect seems so obvious. Get more help sooner. Don't do it all yourself. You cannot do it all yourself, especially with something that is progressive. You're not going to recover from this, and it will not get better. And if you wait until you're wrung out or there's an emergency, that's a really bleak time to make decisions. Much better to do it sooner, if it's at all financially and psychologically possible. Sooner, more help, sooner.
So you came about the research and looking into this whole thing because you were starting to make these tapes of your mom.
Yeah.
But you said you had known for a long time that this story couldn't have been real. What do you think it was about that particular interaction that drove you to do this research?
Honestly, I didn't think it was a book. I really thought this would take me a couple weeks and that it would be a paragraph. And that I'd find out the truth. First of all, that it would be easy to find out the truth, and then I would just tell my mother and we'd have a laugh, and, it'd be like a button on that story. A new punchline. And she was still certainly cognizant and able to tell stories by that point. And I thought, I'll just, fix this story like an editor's note. Unfortunately, I couldn't even really dig into it for almost 2 years because names aren't what I thought they were. People's names, first of all, no one knows what people's original names were in the old country, and then they got changed when they came to North America, and then spellings changed, and then especially with women, when they got married, their last names changed. It's very difficult to follow people through official records. So even though I had official records, I couldn't find my great-grandmother for 2 years. Every name I tried came up as a dead end until I finally, I searched. I work at Tablet at a Jewish magazine, and I was telling this story to my coworkers and telling them, I've looked and I can't find anything. And they said, "That's baloney. You're a journalist. Get on it. Try harder." And I went back that day and kept searching until I found one place where the name I was entering didn't bring up any results, but it said there's a similar name that has results. I said, okay, that's not any spelling I've seen, but let me try. And I plugged that into a database in Manitoba in Canada, and it came up with the rest of her family, and that all matched. And I said, that's it, that's the right person. This is the family. They changed the spelling of Feinstein, used to be Feinstein. And once I had the name right, I could look up her death certificate. And I sent away for it, and it came a month later, and it said, cause of death was bullet through brain, homicide. And I said, wow, if a young woman, and she was 26, I said, if a young woman was murdered, it would have been in the papers. Indeed it was. It was on the front page of the papers. One of the papers from 1913 still exists. So searching their archives was quite simple. The other papers were buried in legislative libraries on microfiche, but I eventually found them, and that took years. But the first paper, I said, there it is. Now I know what happened. I have a source. I can get going. And I found out very quickly that the story my mother told was not true, but that the actual story is maybe more horrifying.
So did you find out who did it?
I think I did. I spent years doing the research and also doing the writing, and it was not a straight line. I didn't quit my job and spend 10 years doing research. I'm not crazy or independently wealthy. Or even dependently wealthy. So I had actually reached kind of a dead end a few years into my research, and at that point, my mother was in this terrible condition at home, and she couldn't remember the story anyway. And I sat back one day and said, "What am I wasting my time for?" I thought this would be, first of all, simple, and second of all, something we could share. That I'd set the record straight with my mother, and now we would share the true family story. And she'd forgotten the original family story. She'd forgotten the sniper story. And I said, what am I wasting my time for? My mother needs my attention. This story is a dead end. And I put it down for 2 years. I just left it in a drawer. And then when my mother moved into a home, I used to speak to her every morning on the phone on my way to work. And once she moved into a home, that was over because she doesn't have a phone. Also, she doesn't really have conversations anymore. But I all of a sudden wasn't able to talk to her for the first time in my life. And I was just missing the sound of her voice. And I remembered, I made this video back in 2010 that I'd never watched because it was too painful to watch my mother's decline on video. I was watching in real life. What did I need a video for? But I said, at least I can hear her voice. I have this one recording of her. And I went back and watched that old video by that point, and something she said in that video that I had never noticed, a light bulb went off in my head. I went, oh, wait, I'm not done researching. There's another way to research. I can find relatives who might also know facts about the story. And now, because of something she said, I knew who to ask and how to start looking for them. And I started the research back again. And after that, I really dug in, and I found 20-some cousins around the world, most of whom I'd never heard of, all of whom I'd never met. And thanks to them and additional resources that came in with like my second push for information, I think I did solve the crime. I really hit a dead end in the middle, and coming back with fresh eyes, I think I did finally solve it.
And the book will be for sale for those who want to know the answer.
No spoilers.
All right, I've been hogging the questions here. I want to turn it over. And if you could say it nice and loud, and then I'm going to repeat it so that the people who are watching us on live stream are able to hear as well.
This is a really compelling set of stories.
Thank you.
Basically, you've articulated three different ways that we get at truth, or that we acquire truth. One is our own experience and memory. One is the stories that are told to us. And the third that you brought out was your research, what is documented, the journalistic record. And you seem to imply, and your story suggests that it is the journalistic record is the highest standard of all, so we really know things. And I wonder whether you can reflect on where we are in our society now with regard to our experience with journalism as the definitive way of knowing things.
All right. So just a very quick recap for people, again, who are online, probably weren't able to hear. The question is, of the many ways that we have to investigate truth, right, through stories, etc., this it was the investigative journalism, right, and then a question about to reflect some on what that means in terms of today's world and where journalism is in the public.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Also a huge question. So, and you've broken it down very neatly, and it's pretty much, I agree with your framework for it. I'll go in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the sections about my mother involve a few different kinds of memory, because there's my memory, which is of course biased. My memory of my childhood is not the same as my sister's memory of the same childhood. It's not my brother's. My memory of incidents is not the same as my father's. So I had to make a decision early on, am I trying to tell the story, or am I telling my story? So it's my story. I know it has biases, and that it's not the truth, but my truth. Then there are my memories of my mother's memories, things that I remember my mother remembering. That's already pretty distant. It's my sort of oblique lens as from my childhood memories of things my mother told me about things that happened decades before I was born. We're getting further and further away from the source material. And then when it came to family, I also, as a journalist, interviewed my family to find out what they remembered. So I have a lot of things on record from my father, who's sitting right here, and my brother and my sister and my aunt and other cousins and friends of my parents. I have them on record in interviews, recent interviews. So there's sort of a combination of memories on that front. The journalistic record, and I'll throw in official documents in the same breath, sort of the official record from the time, from 1913, is extremely useful, but it's extremely useful in the aggregate. It's not particularly useful each document individually, because they are terrible. They are terrible. The official documents, which you think will be the best, like census reports, birth certificates, death certificates, are riddled with inaccuracies. I know they're inaccuracies, sometimes because they're impossible. There's one census report that says my grandmother and one of her sisters are 2 weeks apart in age, which either makes for a very fast pregnancy or the worst twin delivery in history. So not possible. That didn't happen. There's a birth certificate for my oldest uncle that says on his birth certificate, number of children had by this mother, it says 4. I said, well, that's true, but not when he was born. He was the first. How did they know she would go on to have 4 children? And the answer is the birth certificate was filed 20-some years later, probably when he was going to get married. They said, you don't have a birth certificate, so they just made one up. The details, even on official documents, census reports riddled with errors. People's names, in particular in English, they didn't use their English names. So this is my impression of how things happen. The census taker would knock on your door. You didn't fill out a form. The census taker stood there and asked you, probably through an interpreter, how many children do you have? We have 4 children. What are their names in English? And they said, I don't know. What are their names in English? We never use them. What did we call them last time? I don't know. I don't have that on me. And they'd make up new names every time. The names of their children changed every time. So I quickly learned that the things I thought would be pristine, above all else would be official documents, are absolutely not. The newspaper records are one step less pristine, even. So the newspaper reports at the time, there were 3 major dailies in Winnipeg, and they covered it collectively 24 times in 24 articles. Then there was a Yiddish paper in Winnipeg, and then it was in newspapers from Toronto, Montreal, all the way to Vancouver, in English and Yiddish newspapers. I have dozens and dozens of stories in 2 languages. And again, collectively, all the information I think is there. All the information I can find is there. But in the midst of it is a lot of garbage, a lot of things that didn't pan out, a lot of purple prose, a lot of things that I'm pretty sure are factually inaccurate or impossible. Stories that change from one day to the next. And not just like the spelling of someone's name, but key details are completely changed. The biases in newspaper reporting then are readily apparent. I'll give you one good example. The newspapers had no particular fondness for the Jews. That's clear. But the Jews weren't the bottom of the barrel, because the fellow immigrants in the same neighborhood were even lower on the feeding chain, on the food chain for these newspapers. So like the Lower East Side of New York, the north end of Winnipeg is where pretty much all the Jews lived, but most people who lived there weren't Jews. It was just an immigrant neighborhood. All the Jewish immigrants lived there, and lots of non-Jewish immigrants, in this case, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians. Stefan Kashowski, who's the main suspect that I just read about, the brakeman for the railway, of the 3 major dailies, 2 of them say right off the bat, Tim, he's the one, go get him. The third says no, right from the outset. And I'm thinking, oh, so they're being cautious, they're gonna say, wait till the facts are in, don't condemn this man until we have a trial. No, the reason they say it can't be him is, as they say, this is a crime of tremendous cunning, and he's Polish, and those people are too stupid to commit a crime of this cunning, and so it can't be him because they're too dumb. This is their defense of him, is that he's a swarthy Pole who's too dumb to commit this crime. So at least once I'm reading the newspaper reports, I get the sense, it's not hard to get the sense, that they are biased, incomplete, and inaccurate. It's particularly aggravated here because they don't speak the same language as the people they're talking to. They're interviewing neighbors on the street who, first of all, are into gossip. They're neighbors. Second, they're playing games of telephone. They're on the street saying, I heard that someone else told me this. Oh, really? Well, I heard that someone else, this person told me that someone else told me, and by the time it gets to the interview with the newspaper, it's been changed 17 times, and then there's a language barrier. So the information is really not terribly reliable. What I could do as a journalist now is sort of lay out all the articles in front of me and all the census reports and say, this one's, I could just tell it's wrong. My grandmother and her sister were not 2 weeks apart in birth. I know it's not true. It's not possible. Throw that one out. I could look and see this newspaper seemed to pay more attention to detail, so I trust them more. They quote people directly. They don't just paraphrase. They have people's names and addresses, not just last names and initials. So they have more detail, so I'm going to trust them more. In the end, I do think all the information is there, but it's a matter of sifting through the garbage, which is kind of what I might say about journalism today. I think, again, in the aggregate, the information you're looking for is out there. And overall, things that are true are being reported. And then there's the garbage. And the trick is to sift through it in real time. As real time gets faster and faster, real time back in 1913 was, by the time the inquest happened, it had been a month. And people had sort of said, oh yeah, remember that crazy article they printed about possible suspects 2.5 weeks ago? Like, that was clearly crazy, but people had already forgotten it. It was already clear that that was crazy. Today, you're responding to things in 10 seconds, 20 seconds. You're liking something, you're retweeting something, you're commenting. Oh, please don't comment or ever read comments. But these things happen almost instantaneously, and people do not have the time, and if they do, they don't take the time to sift through the garbage to get to the truth. It's not always obvious, it's not always possible to tell, but certainly people can react as though they know the truth, even when it's not clear at all. So in that respect, what's happening today is not so different from what was happening a century ago. It's just at the speed of light compared to the way it was back then when you had one newspaper story a day. Now it's, since we've been talking, your phone is filled up with horrible, bizarre garbage. By the way, subscribe to Tablet Magazine.
Yes, Janaki.
She was 3.
So she would be right on the edge of having memory loss. The 2 infants in the room, unfortunately, we had no memory.
Exactly.
I'm curious whether you had any sense of residual trauma that your grandmother had, and may have also been passed that to your mother, and whether you can answer.
So the question is, for your grandmother, who was old enough to have more cognition by that point at age 3, any residual trauma that you know about from that, and any of that passed on through the family?
I think there was. So as I did interviews with family members for research, I interviewed all of my grandmother has been gone for for almost 40 years, and her siblings are all also gone. But their children and grandchildren are still here, many of them, and I interviewed as many as I possibly could. What was interesting was to see the differences in who knew what about the murder. This BS story about a drive-by sniper was my grandmother's invention. No one else in the family has heard of it. No other branch of the family had heard. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why my grandmother created it. I don't know when she created it. I don't know why. It is not a less terrifying story to share with your children that you should be afraid of going outside on the front porch. I don't know what good the story does. Most of the family heard nothing, and I mean nothing, like not a word. Many of them didn't know anything about the murder. Part of that is understandable, well, in 2 ways. One, people didn't talk about such things, but also my great-grandfather, within 2 years, remarried and had more children. It's understandable that the new children never heard about the murder of a woman they'd never met who had no connection to them. And it's also understandable that my great-grandfather didn't keep going on and on and on and on and on about his first wife to his second wife. So it's understandable that these stories didn't really get passed down in much complexity. But they really weren't passed down at all. And in particular, the children of Anne, who's the baby in the crib, the infant in the crib, when her mother is murdered, she's 7 months old. When I contacted her children, who were in their 60s and 70s, one has since passed away, they didn't know the story. But once I shared the story with them, they both said, oh, this explains a lot. This explains our mother's behavior, how throughout her life she was apparently very paranoid about making sure doors were locked before people went to sleep, never sleeping with the door closed so that you could always see into the kids' rooms. They said she was really paranoid about all these things, and maybe that's why. My grandmother, I don't remember anything that I saw as inherited trauma. But then again, my grandmother, there were 8 people in her family, 8 siblings. She was the first to leave the family. At 19, she up and left and came to the States alone. And I know that sounds like not a big deal to go from Canada to the States, but this is back in the 20s. She came to the States, lived alone as a single independent woman in New York for a better part of a decade before she got married. And in those days, you didn't have text on your cell phone. And I think from the 20s until the time my great-grandfather died in 1971, I think she saw him 3 more times. That's it. She wasn't in regular contact. She really up and left. I can deduce that was probably trauma-related to get out of there, to just get away from there. But the greatest part I found about the trauma, so my great-aunt Anne, the one who was locking doors and checking for closed doors, who never told her children what happened. She did tell her granddaughter, ironically, her granddaughter, who's in her 30s, had a school project. She grew up in Marin County, California. School project, like, talk about your family tree. And she went and asked her parents. Her parents said, I don't know, ask your grandmother. And she asked her grandmother, and her grandmother opened up for the first time. And she told her the story of the murder. Not the sniper story, and no details, but that she had been murdered. And she gave her a photograph, which is a cropped version of there's only one photograph of Sarah. It's her wedding photo. But for her funeral, they had a memorial card that was just the cropped version of her face. She had that. She'd kept it all those years. She never showed her own children, but she gave it to her granddaughter, who then gave it to me. When Anne, the baby in the crib, this grandmother, when she was getting older, she took her family photos, and rather than leave them for her children like my grandmother did, even though they were just in a plastic bag, she did leave them, Anne burned them. And when her children said, what are you doing? She said, you don't know these people anyway. There's nothing to remember. So, yeah, I think inherited trauma. That's, I think, the clearest case I found. And that, to me, that speaks volumes, that you would actually destroy your family memories completely.
Well, I'm sure that we could stay here all night talking about this, but I know that we do have a Selichot service, and in certain ways, this last question, I think, helps us to transition, because that the things that we don't know, right, about ourselves, about our families, the things that we need to dig deeper to be able to discover, often can inform us a lot about certain things that we do and why we have these quirky things that we think about ourselves. And so I want to thank you so much for digging into your family's history, to sharing that with us, to enticing us to buy you the book, and to help us get into this mode of self-introspection as we head into Selichot. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully everyone has a copy of the booklet. If you don't, Warren Berger has got a few coming around. And I'll actually take care of the announcement I was going to ask Rabbi Lehman to make, which is that for those of you who are joining us on the live stream, there should be a link on that launching page that has a copy of this booklet in a PDF so that you can open it up and follow along with us. With that, we will begin.
return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Join me. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are born and reborn again. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you were born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul.
Let's turn to page 1 and read responsively the opening prayer. We are gathered together this night, embraced by the peace of this sanctuary, away from the clamor and glare of the world, away from its confusions and terrors, grateful for the opportunity to meditate upon the year that has gone and to pray for the year to come. We face not only a new year, but a changing world where new knowledge and continual upheavals threaten all life everywhere. Our lives are burdened with failure and wrongdoing. Our hearts are torn by jealousies and hates. Prejudice confuses our thoughts. Sin distorts our lives. We are ridden by fears, tormented by frustrations, by loneliness, and by endless desires. Too often straying like shepherdless sheep, we seek direction on our way. Our God and God of our ancestors, we pray that the light of your presence will dispel the plague of darkness which threatens to overwhelm us. May this service of penitence help us express the noblest yearnings of our souls, that we may meet the new year with the best of heart and mind with which you have endowed us. We have come to offer our fervent plea for forgiveness, for the divine gift to recognize evil, and for the will to overcome it. We pray for the ability to recognize what is good and for the will to promote it. We seek the joy of attaining lives that are good in your sight. Help us, O God, to bridge the gap between our conscience and our conduct, between what we believe and what we do. We plead for the assurance you so graciously gave to our ancestors of old, I will pardon even as you ask. Amen.
אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללוך סלה. אשריהם שכחלות ותהילת דוד תהילת אדוני ידבר פי, ויברך כה בשר שם קודשו לעולם ועד. ואנחנו נברך מעתה ועד עולם. הללויה. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא תברך חירותי, וימליך מלכותי. בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבו מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה על שמי קודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יה לה לה יה לה לה ya la la 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 ya 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 la la הנשמה לך והגוף פולך חוסה חוסה על המלאך. הנשמה לך והגוף שלך אדוני עשה למען שמך. יה לה לה יה לה לה יה לה לה la la, ya la la. עתנו על שמך, אדוני, עשה למען שמך. בעבור כבוד שמך, כי אל חרום ורחום שמך. למען שמך, אדוני, וסלחת לעווננו, כי רב הוא.
A thought about our lives are in your keeping. I never leave home without my smartphone. I even have it with me on Shabbat in case of emergency. Having it in my pocket, asking Siri questions, reading the news, I feel as if I am in control. The world is at my fingertips, and I feel as if I have so much power. Yet, of course, I realize that no matter how hard I search on Google, I won't find the cure to the common cold. Though my phone keeps accurate time, it can't tell me the length of my days. No matter how advanced my AirPods are, I can't keep out all the noise, and I can't find the quiet and peace that I may seek. This is when I realize that it's okay to let go. In fact, I realize I must let go. Technology gives us a false sense of security. What we need to understand is that, as strange as it may sound, when we put ourselves in God's hands, we feel more secure. As we say twice a day in this season in Psalm 27, Adonai ma'oz chayai mimi efchad. God is the strength of my life, whom shall I fear? But we are not saying that we are ceding control of our lives to God. What I think we are saying is that we are partnering with God. We agree to let go so that we get stronger and more confident. We let go so that we follow a path of religious, ethical, and moral values. We let go so that our path is always straight before us. We let go and we let God in so that we can be the best person we can be. As Psalm 27 concludes, Kaveh el Adonai, chazak v'yametz libecha, v'kaveh el Adonai. Hope in God, be strong, take courage, and hope in God. I pray every day that by partnering with God, I will be stronger and more resilient. May we all achieve such comfort and strength in God's keeping in the new year. Amen.
Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Adonai Selichot Bokein Levavot Gole Amukot Dove הבריות, יודע כל נסתרות, כובש עוונות, לובש צדקות, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו, מלא זכיות, נורא תהילות, סולח עוונות, עונה בצרות, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו. פועל ישועות, צופה עתידות, קורא הדורות, רוכב ערבות, שומע תפילות, תמים דעות, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו. יא לה 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 לה, יא לה 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 לה, יא לה 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 לה, יא לה 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 לה, יא לה 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 לה, חטאנו לפניך, רחם עלינו.
On the power of forgiveness. As a fifth grader, we were paired with kindergartners. They called us buddies. I thought, I know how to work with kids. This will be good. And on the first day, a little boy and a little girl, they got in a fight. And the Israeli teacher, I looked to her for advice, and she just gave me a head nod, like, "Nu, deal with it." Okay, I take 3 seats, I sit down with them, I ask them each to explain their side of the story. The little girl, who'd been the instigator, she said what she'd done wrong. I asked for clarification from the little boy, and I said to her, "Okay, so apologize." And she did. It was great. I thought kids don't often say I'm sorry. She said, "I'm sorry for what?" She explained. And I said to him, "Do you forgive her?" And he stood up, he came to me, and he whispered in my ear, "What do I say now?" We spend so much time, especially at this season, saying to ourselves, have I thought through my entire year? Have I thought through my actions? Do I know who to ask for forgiveness? Am I ready to be forgiven? And we often fail to do the other side of the equation. Have we thought through those that have offended us? And have we prepared ourselves to do the work of forgiving? In this season, in the days leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, let us not forget to do the other half of the equation. Are we willing to do the work? Are we ready to forgive?
Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are born and reborn again. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you were born and reborn again. Ya ya Eloi, Eloi, ya Eloi, Eloi, ya Eloi, Eloi, ya Eloi, Eloi, Eloi. Please rise and turn to page 5. Tavor al pesha v'timchei Hashem ki yom vayityatzei v'imo sham ta'zin shavatenu v'takshiv menu mamar ki yom vayikra v'shem Adonai v'sham ne'emar vayavor Adonai al panav vayikra Adonai, Adonai el rachum v'chanun erech hapayim v'rav chesed v'emet notzer chesed la'alafim nosei avon v'fesha v'chata v'nokeh v'salakt alavonenu u'chatatenu u'nchatanu selach lanu avinu ki chatanu mechal lanu malkeinu ki chatanu ki ata Adonai tov v'salach v'rav chesed l'chol korecha. You may be seated. B'motzai menucha kidamnu chatechila hatoznecha mimarom hatoznecha mimarom yoshev techila lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila et yemino zorera et yemino zorera lasot chayil betzedek nekad v'nishchat tamurayil kinonna gizo b'zakam be'od layil lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila deroshna dorshecha bedorshom panecha hidaresh lamu mishmei me'onecha ulshavat chinunam al talei moznecha lishmoa el harin
One of the reasons that I wanted to share my reflection after that is, I don't know if I'm the only one who does this, but sometimes when I wake up, I've got a song in my head. And half the time it's Lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila. And I don't know why. And I never heard that particular tune until I moved here 11 years ago. But it's gotten into my head. But one of the things that I noticed in looking at the text is that it translates lishmoa as to hear. But I was asked to give a reflection on not the power of hearing, but the power of listening. And I can tell you that they're not the same thing. For one, as the spouse of somebody who is profoundly hearing impaired, and who very often doesn't hear, but that doesn't prevent her from listening. But a few years ago, I read something, and it was, in the context of so much of the trouble and division in our country about the fact that people don't often listen. And the question that this article asked is, if you are having a discussion with another person, are you listening to what they say, or are you formulating your response? And I realize that I am more often than not formulating my response. And just that one little note helped me, I think, to really reorient some of the way I discuss things with people, to really stop formulating my response and really just trying to hear and understand what they're saying. And then really this week I read something that was very similar to that thought, where Plato says that it is better to lose an argument than to win an argument, right? Because if you lose an argument, you know for sure that you have heard what your interlocutor says, and you have taken it seriously, and you've understood it, and you've learned something. Whereas if you simply win an argument, you may not have really learned anything at all. And so I think the power of listening really is a way for us to really reorient our lives at its best, and to really
begin to heal some of the pain in our individual souls and in our national soul.
Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul.
Page 6, we rise as we are able.
אל הורית לנו לומר 13 וזכור לנו היום ברית 13 כמו שהודעת לעניו מקדם כמו שכתוב וירד אדוני בענן ויתייצב עמו שם ויקרא בשם אדוני ויעבור אדוני על פניו ויקרא אדוני אדוני אל רחום וחנון ערך אפיים ורב חסד ואמת נוצר חסד לאלפים נושא עוון ופשע וחטא ונקה וסלחת לעווננו ולחטאתנו ונחלתנו סלח לנו אבינו כי חטאנו מחל לנו מלכנו כי פשענו כי אתה אדוני טוב וסלח ורב חסד לכל קוראיך. שמע קולנו אדוני אלוהינו חוס ורחם עלינו וקבל ברחמים וברצון את תפילתנו. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדיש ימינו כקדם. אל תשליכנו מלפניך ורוח קודשך אל תיקח ממנו.
Page 7, please remain standing.
Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu tavo lefanecha tefilateinu ve'al titala mitechinatenu she'en anachnu azeifanim ukeshei oref lomar lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu tzadikim anachnu ve'lo chatanu aval anachnu va'avoteinu chatanu. Ay, 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 Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu Dofi. Ay, 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 Hevinu, Veirshanu, Zadnu, Hamasnu, Tafalnu Sheker. Ay, 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 Ya'atznu Ra, Kizavnu, Latznu, Maradnu, Niatznu, Sararnu, Avinu, Pashanu, Tsararnu, Kishinu Oref. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 Rashanu, Shichatnu, Tiavnu, Ta'inu, Titanu. Sarnu mimitzvotecha umimishpatecha hatovim velo shava lanu ve'ata tzadik al kol haba aleinu ki emet asita va'anachnu hirshanu.
Please be seated.
At the large suburban Reformed congregation where I grew up in metropolitan Detroit, one of the things that I looked forward to each year at the high holidays was the opportunity to see people who I only saw once a year in that place at that time. And there was something comforting about that, and certainly something that I would look forward to. And so the first time that I was going to be spending the high holidays in a smaller venue, I wondered what it was going to be like to not have that largeness. Would it still have the same power that I was used to? And the answer was no, but in the best of ways. Because it didn't have that same power of the largeness. It rather had the power of being together with people who knew me and who I knew, whose life stories I knew, and whose vulnerabilities I could open up myself to, my own vulnerabilities to them. There is something powerful, I think, for all of our communities, right? We've all chosen our synagogues for many different reasons, but I think in part because there is the opportunity when we are with people who we know, people who have gone through the struggles, who know where we are, that we can come together and take that collective responsibility at this time where we are feeling most vulnerable. To know that when we say, Ashamnu, Bagadnu, it is we have done these things. Maybe I didn't do this. Maybe the person next to me. Whoever it may have been, right? I'm there for them. And whichever of these that I have done, I know that there are other people who are holding me up too. And so as we go into these holidays, I hope that we're all able to allow ourselves the vulnerability and to feel the strength then that comes when we are together in community.
Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are born and reborn again. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Shomer, shomer Yisrael, shemor sherit Yisrael. Shomer, shomer Yisrael, shemor sherit Yisrael. Ve'al yovad Yisrael, ve'al yovad Yisrael haomerim, haomerim shema Yisrael. Shomer, shomer goy echad, shemor sheritam echad. Shomer, shomer goy echad, shemor sheritam echad. Ve'al yovad goy echad, ve'al yovad goy echad ham yachadim. Shemcha Adonai Eloheinu Adonai echad. Shomer, shomer goy kadosh, shemor sheritam kadosh. Shomer, shomer goy kadosh, shemor sheritam kadosh. Ve'al yovad goy kadosh, ve'al yovad goy kadosh ham shalashim v'shalosh kedushot lekadosh. Avinu malkeinu, choneinu vaneinu. Avinu malkeinu, choneinu vaneinu, ki en banu masim. Aseimanu tzedakah v'chesed. Aseimanu tzedakah v'chesed, ve'oshia חוננו בנינו, אבינו מלכנו, חוננו בנינו, כי אין בנו מעשים. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא תברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי חון ויומי חון וחייך בית ישראל, בגלה ובזמן קריב יאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי קודשה בריחו לילה מן כל בכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בימיו יאמרו אמן. תתקבץ לוטון ואותון דכו ישראל קודם ובהון ושמיה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן.
Closing prayer, we read responsively. Our God and God of our ancestors, grant us of your Spirit that we may be cleansed of the jealousies and hates, the grudges and pettiness, the treachery and prejudice which befoul life and poison happiness. Remove the clouds that hover above us. Lift from our hearts the threatening burdens of fear and loneliness. May the coming year bring to all people, to all nations, the handmaiden of justice, and that love must be found. O merciful God, grant us the understanding and the will to love mercy, to live justly, and to walk humbly before you. May our hearts be open with generosity and our hands ready with kindness. May our faith in the attainment of peace for all humanity remain unshaken. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts find expression in our lives day by day, helping us to overcome the sins in our own lives and in the lives of those who are around us. May all our aspirations for good soon be fulfilled. Amen.
Page 9, Yigdal. Yigdal Elohim Chai ve'yishtabach nimtza ve'enet el metziuto echad ve'en yachid ke'ichudo ne'elam ve'gam en sof le'achdutto en od mutaguf ve'en oguf lo naroch elav kedushato kadmon lechol davar asher ivra rishon ve'en reshit lereshito.
Hino Adon Olam lechol notzar yoreg gedulato umalchuto shefa nevuato letahano
شرا كريشاتو يشلق لكيت يمين مشيخينو ليفتوت مخاكي كيت يشواتو ميتيم يخايل برov خاستو baruch adayod shem tehilato meitim yechayel berov chasto baruch adayod shem tehilato.
I just want to thank my colleagues, Rabbi Charles Arian, Rabbi Jonah Lehman, Rabbi Jesse Nagelberg, and our cantors, Adina Ackerman, Rochelle Helsner, and Kim Comrade, for being here and helping to lead us through this service this evening, to help us to prepare ourselves to get into the mood, to go home humming the melodies, and to be thinking about where we are, where we want to be in the coming year. And I want to wish all of you a Shana Tova and U'Metuka. May this next year be a good year, a year of health for all of us, a year of healing for our nation, and a year of sweetness.
Great, good, I'm glad. Yeah, and I really liked Dina.
Likewise, Michelle, thank you very much.